And we're back. So we described what an argument is with attention to, yes, persuasion by reason, but we paid attention to what makes an argument different from just an explanation or a story. The degree to which there are logical connections between the propositions. Argument. In the end, we want to evaluate arguments, decide whether an argument is good or not, but deciding whether an argument is good or not has a few logically prior steps. Before you can make a ruling on that's a valid argument and the premises are true, or that's a strong argument, or no, that's crap. First, you need to analyze the argument and understand the argument. In 914, we do or section 914, we actually do through a whole example of that. To really pass judgment on an argument, you need to understand how the argument works. And to understand how an argument works, logically prior to that, is identifying an argument. Is it an argument at all? It's not always easy to tell. Here's one example of something that is both an argument and a story. Okay, some guy in Colorado accidentally shot himself with a nail gun. He didn't realize that there was a nail in his head until days later when he went to the dentist complaining of a major toothache. So the dentist is like, well, we love to do x-rays. Let's x-ray your head. And the dentist is like, oh, there's a nail in your head. That's the problem. So they pulled the nail out and the guy seems to have recovered. Physically. But financial recovery may be more difficult. Although he could have afforded it at the time, he had decided against buying medical insurance, and he's in the United States. So now he's unable to pay the $100,000 in medical bills. There is, in that story, both an argument and a non-argument, just a sort of a report. Because he can't afford to pay his giant medical bills is logically connected to the statement he should have bought health insurance. If the conclusion of the story is he should have bought health insurance, then it's an argument. Because he can't pay his medical bills is really logically connected to that. However, there's also non-arguments in there. He went to the dentist complaining of a toothache. And he had the toothache because he had a nail in his head. There's the word because. The word because shows up somewhere else too. He should have bought medical insurance because he currently can't pay his medical bills. That because is doing two things. In the medical bill case, it's signaling it's a premise indicator. He should have bought medical insurance. Why? Because he can't pay his bills. Because is operating as a premise indicator. But in the toothache and the nail in his head, he had a toothache because he had a nail in his head. That involves a because, but it's not really an argument. Well, it could be if we took issue. No, you don't have a toothache. Prove that you have a toothache. And he pulls out his X-ray. I think this giant nail thing, maybe that's causing it. I don't know. Did it really hit a nerve? I don't know. It would be pretty unlikely that someone is making an issue of his claim to have a toothache. If they're not making an issue of it, then because he had a nail in his head is just extra information. Which is nice. It gives us... Sometimes we like to have more details. But it's not really an argument. Another example where because shows up in maybe a not argument would be the patient died because he had a heart attack. If we're okay with the claim that the patient died, it wouldn't really be an argument. The fact that he died isn't an issue. If it's a non-argument, then because he had a heart attack is just extra information. Of course, theoretically, someone could make an issue of the cause of death. No, you should list the cause of death as coronavirus. He had coronavirus, which caused him to have blood clots that caused the heart attack. If we're fighting about the cause of death, then we might have an issue to debate. But even if we're fighting about the cause, we wouldn't really be debating whether the guy's alive or not. Usually that's pretty settled when you're debating a cause of death. Usually the guy is definitely dead. No, he's not dead. Yeah, he's probably dead. In most times where you say the patient died because he had a heart attack, or the patient had a heart attack and died, would be a more non-argument way of saying those two propositions. He is dead and he had a heart attack. And sometimes you'd even have a because there. Whether something's an argument depends largely on whether we have made an issue out of the end statement of that story. When we've made an issue out of one of the story's claims, then we have reason to make an argument, and we might construct an argument out of all the other details in a story. But if something's not an issue, like we trust that the heart attack patient's dead, we trust that the guy with a nail in his head indeed had a toothache. We're not like, no, you're faking sick, come into work anyway, you don't have a toothache, prove it! Unless we're asking him to prove that he had the toothache, here's my X-ray! Unless we're doing that, chances are, because he had a nail in his head, was just extra information. That makes it a more detailed, interesting story. So, whether or not something's an argument depends on whether there are syllogisms that connect the facts. This because marks an inference, or whether they're just a connected series of statements that are sequential details in a story. Detecting syllogisms or the absence of a syllogism is sort of hard to do. So an easier way of deciding on whether something's an whether at least we're even looking for an argument is whether anyone has made an issue of any of a story's claims. If I'm saying, no, he didn't have a toothache, now I want to debate. Now I've made an issue of a certain claim. Maybe we don't have an argument there yet, but at least we're looking for an argument, and might turn the story into an argument to establish the truth of the proposition, yes, he had a toothache. So that's the scenery around arguments. Arguments, functionally, their purpose is to settle issues, to arrive at a consensus about the truth value of some proposition. Arguments are a connected series of statements. They're stories, basically. Arguments are a subset of stories. It's a story that has causal logical connections between certain propositions. And those connections are called inferences. And since they're so important and there are a limited number of inference patterns. So when actually analyzing an argument, we like to have a library of all the inference patterns. So we can just look at that. We don't need to spend half a day trying to think of counterexamples to decide whether an inference pattern is always workable or not. So since these inference patterns can take up a lot of our time, but there's a limited number of them, we like to just look up the inference pattern, look up the stock patterns. Since they're so important and save us a lot of time, we've invented a word for inference patterns. It's called syllogisms. They're really important to logic, which is the foundation of critical thinking. So syllogisms are good. They're there for us. And luckily the ancients and medievals had spent many years of many people's careers ironing out syllogisms so that we don't have to. Okay. Good night.